Добрый вечер, дорогие гости. Мы рады вас снова приветствовать в стенах Московского Кремля, в стенах одностолбной палаты Патриаршего дворца. Здесь уже очень много лиц нам знакомых, потому что мы, вот тот лекционный цикл, который связан с выставочным проектом «Генри Мур и классический канон современного искусства», уже достигает пика своего. И мы сегодня очень рады видеть вас снова и надеемся увидеть вас еще и на следующей лекции, которая будет посвящена творчеству Джейкоба Эпстайна. Я еще раз хочу напомнить, что это цикл, который организует Музеи Московского Кремля в сотрудничестве с Британским советом. И сегодня у нас замечательный гость, которого я имею удовольствие и честь представить. Это один из ведущих специалистов по современному британскому искусству, глава отдела современного британского искусства в галерее Тейт, доктор Крис Стивенс. И у нас есть особый повод поздравить его по такому случаю, что недавно в галерее Тейт открылась блестящая выставка «Пикассо и современное британское искусство». И мы рады успеху доктора Стивенса, и мы очень рады, что он нашел возможность приехать и прочесть лекцию в этом курсе. Крис Стивенс, прошу быть здоровым.
Спасибо. Well, firstly, I would like to say how pleased I am to be here in Moscow and seeing Henry Moore, our great British artist, here in Russia. This is my first time in Russia, so it's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to thank everyone at the Kremlin Museum for inviting me and for making me so welcome and laying on such a lovely visit. The second thing I should say before I start is that the way I normally lecture is to put together some slides and then to ramble informally to them, and then I realize that there are too many and I go faster. I've been told today, because everything is being translated, to be very short, and we will try not to speak over each other, so forgive me if I'm working in an unfamiliar way, so bear with me. So I'll start. What I want to do, my theme is Henry Moore and tradition, and I want to use that to think about how Henry Moore became, first of all, the leading modern artist in Britain, and then later in the 1940s and 1950s and 60s, the leading sculptor in the Western world. And I think we'll see that the things that made him so successful also became a problem for him at the end of his life and subsequently. And the key to this, I think, is that Henry Moore is an artist of harmony, of synthesis, of reconciliation, if you like. And I think in thinking about that desire to make an art that brings life together, that is an art that is affirmative, we must remember the period of history in which Henry Moore lived. Henry Moore is a man who fought in the First World War and was gassed in the trenches in Flanders. He lived through the political traumas of the 1930s, and like many people on the left of politics in Britain, was very seriously engaged with the campaign, at least, against fascism. And we should also acknowledge that after the Second World War, he became the most favoured artist for the British government to send abroad, as an artist who was both modern but also easily accessible to people, as a riposte, I think, to socialist realism. What I will sketch out is that Henry Moore brings together three different traditions. We start at the beginning. This is a work that is lost, but it's one of the first works he made after the First World War in the early 1920s, A Mother and Child, which would become his major theme. And we can see, I think, how the work relates to the carvings of the Mayan tradition from Central America, from Guatemala and Mexico, which Henry Moore discovered the non-Western arts of Africa, of Central America, of the rest of the world, soon after the First World War, through books, through reading writings on art. So he's not the first artist, of course, to make this discovery. He follows Picasso, Brancusi, Matisse and others. And it's often, the mistake is often made to think that artists like Moore look to these earlier or other traditions for style alone. But in fact, there's much more to it than that. I think one of the things Moore liked about Mayan sculpture was that what he called its stoniness. But also I think it is important that these, in looking at these non-academic traditions, it was not only an escape from academic style, but also he looked to arts which dealt with the fundamentals of life. So what Henry Moore and his contemporaries thought of as primitive art dealt with the themes of birth, of sex and of death. And I think there is an echo of those themes in Moore's work also, as is clear in this comparison with an Aztec sculpture and the same mother and child. He had a particular interest in the Mayan and Aztec traditions, and it's worth noting that when he said he admired their stoniness, for the most part he knew them through plaster reproduction in London and Paris. But he also, other cultures' art that he admired included the ancient Egyptian, particularly the sedate, seated figures, and I think also the detail of the back here on the right, which repeatedly appears in the works of Henry Moore, this attention to the spine and the hair that falls down the back. The motif of the clasped hands is very common in Henry Moore's work of the 1920s and early 1930s, and it's best seen in this work, which I believe is in the other part of the exhibition, an extraordinary sculpture, and for people who haven't seen it in the flesh, it often looks like it will be enormous, not sort of almost hand-sized. But this sculpture is very important also because it brings together two things: this interest in non-Western tradition, but also Henry Moore's concern with his English identity. During the 1920s and 1930s, Henry Moore consciously explored different English stones. So for those of you who know England, the identity of one small region and its difference from another is in large part determined by the stones from which the houses are built, the roads are made and so on. And Moore talked about this investigation of his own Englishness after coming home from the war and the trauma of the war. This material is called Cumberland alabaster. Alabaster, as you know, is a familiar material for sculpture. Cumberland alabaster he got from a friend, John Skeeping, another sculptor, who knew a farmer in Cumberland in the north of England who dug it out of his fields. So the farmer would plough up these rocks from his fields and put them on the train to London for modern sculptors to turn into strange pseudo primitivist works of art. So you can see how Moore brings together that Englishness of the material with this very clear primitivizing style. The clasped hands come from the sculptures of Sumeria from 2000 years before Christ, as do the sort of startling eyes. Again, this cat or animal is from Sumeria, from the same period. But one other thing I would draw attention to in the Henry Moore is the way the figure seems to be looking into the distance. And I think that this recurs in Moore's work in the 1920s and 30s and also after the Second World War. And I think there is a sense of anxiety communicated by this anxious stare into the distance. His figures look like hunted animals often. And I think that is one of the reasons he becomes the artist of what his friend W.H. Auden, the poet, called the Age of Anxiety. Just moving on, he was also interested in, well, one should remember, I guess, that in the 1920s and 1930s, the term primitive in art history also encompassed the Romanesque style, anything pre-Renaissance or non-classical. So we can see the work at the top is a relief he made, an embodiment of the north wind, and for it he looks to Autun Cathedral in France for a Romanesque image of Eve. We saw earlier one of his earliest sculptures is with the mother and child theme, and that becomes one of the dominant themes of his career. But there's a short period of about 18 months, 2 years, when almost half of Henry Mur's sculptures are on the theme of the mother and child. This is probably the most famous and the most important, made in Hornton stone from the middle of England. And notice again the way the mother looks into the distance like a sort of protective, anxious animal, and away from her child. And I think one of the striking things about this group of sculptures of the mother and child is the range of different physical relationships between the parent and the child, and how many of them do not communicate a sense of love or intimacy, but distance and separation. And it's worth noting perhaps that these sculptures, this period of mother and child sculptures, comes soon after Henry Mur marries his wife Irina, but a long time before they have their one and only child, Mary. Of course, the mother and child theme in Western art is best known as a religious one of the Madonna and Child, though it had been revived in Britain in the 19th century as part of a new sentimentality in painting and sculpture. But of course, in the non-Western traditions, it was very familiar as an image of one of those essential aspects of life and the continuity of life, of birth and renewal. On the left, there's a mother and child from North American sculpture, and on the right from Africa. And of course, I think Mur belongs to a tradition in which, a sculptural tradition, in which the female figure embodies a much broader sense of growth and fecundity. And that's particularly noticeable in this lost sculpture, which he makes around 1930, in which the baby is shown suckling at the mother's breast, but the mother has disappeared. She is only the breast, reduced simply to that, the function of mother. So, as I say, Mur is looking to these non-Western traditions not only for to refresh the style of sculpture, but also to recover this what he would see as more authentic art dealing with the fundamentals of life, of growth, of birth, of generation. Now, this is Henry Mur's reclining figure of 1929. It's often seen as the masterpiece of this early period of primitivizing work. And in particular, this work is related to the famous Shack Mule from a site in Yucatan in Mexico, which Mur knew as a plaster reproduction in the Trocadero in Paris. In fact, what strikes me is how different they are. The Shack Mule is a very rigid figure who lies flat on his back. The only part of the body that turns is the head to one side. In contrast, Mur's figure lies on one side, resting on one arm, but turns her body towards us, her upper body towards us, and raises her arm. And what strikes me, but has rarely been mentioned in relation to this work, is how sexy it is. And it relates to the odalisque, a tradition in Western art, particularly associated in Mur's time with Matisse. Now, what's important for me, one of the things important to me for Henry Mur is how later in life he acquired an image which I think he encouraged of being someone who's rather homely and rather conservative. After 1940, you never see a photograph of Henry Moore without a tie. But in this early period, I think you can see that there is a darkness and a sexuality that comes out in some of his works that is very important and that has often been forgotten. This is a work from 1931, which originally was made in lead, which would have made, the lead is lost, but would have made it a very different kind of object. And I think you can see how, what an uncomfortable and confrontational figure this is, where the rib cage becomes like a prison, and the bottom part of the woman's body is turned towards us and the legs opened in a very unambiguous symbol of sexual availability. And it's at this point, I think, that Moore comes closest to Picasso. This is a Picasso from 1929, just shortly before. And also, like Picasso, is at this time close to surrealism and the surrealism of Bataille, of idea of the body that is defined by these fundamental urges. The source, talking of the body turning in a way that is much more sophisticated than you see in Mayan sculpture, the source for that most obviously is the work of Michelangelo. This is one of the figures from the Medici Chapel in Florence. Henry Moore had visited Italy in 1925 and at the time and for a long time said he was so involved with other forms of art that he couldn't really respond to what he saw in Italy. But I think on the contrary, he consciously brought together what he saw in Italy with what he was learning in the British Museum. So in fact, the importance of this work by Henry Moore on the left is that it brings together the Mayan tradition of the shack mole, the Western tradition of the Michelangelo, and also that embodiment of female sexuality of the odalisque of Matisse and others. Later, Moore's interest and debt to the Greek and Roman tradition of sculpture became self-evident, and Moore clearly is signalling his interest in that tradition. I think Moore was not a modest man, like many artists, and he wished to see himself as one of the tradition from Phidias through Michelangelo to the present day. So you see echoes in his work of the Greek tradition. The figure on the right is from the Parthenon in Athens. And of course, as the entablature sculptures and the sculptures from the pediments of the Parthenon are in the British Museum in London, Moore had particularly easy access to those. And you can see in a series of Henry Moore sculptures of the mid-1950s how he deliberately, I think consciously, adopts the Greek drapery style, the drapery style of the Parthenon sculptures. It's quite hard to see there, the very tight folds of the drapery. The work on the left is very typical of Henry Moore in showing this generously built female figure, an embodiment, as I said, of natural fertility, if you like. But there is also, and particularly in the 1950s, a number of works in which the body is very evidently fragmented. Now, I said earlier how late in life Moore became more conservative, and he looked back at this work, which he made in 1953, 54, as having memories of the Second World War, of Britain standing alone against the German bombardment. And so in this sculpture, this image of a figure with one arm missing and one leg missing and the other truncated takes on a very particular and emotive theme, but especially because I think actually this is not a figure, a representation of resilience. I think this figure is captured at the moment that it actually collapses. It's one of a series of works, I think, from different periods of Henry Moore's career, which he made as a statement against war. And it was made, not incidentally, it was made importantly in the middle of the Korean War, when Britain was again at war. But of course the model of the fragmented figure comes from the classical tradition. This is the Belvedere torso from the Vatican. And I think it's especially clear when you look at the maquette for the warrior with shield. This figure on the right is the maquette. It's about this size. And it's typical of Henry Moor's way of working in that he would find a piece of wood, or in particular a stone that he saw on the ground that suggested something. He would pick it up and add to it plasticine so that it became a figure or whatever it is. And of course, like any great artist, he would make that figure with, in his mind, a dictionary of the great works of art of the past. But just as a footnote, of course, I want to make the point that in talking about Henry Moor drawing on these other traditions and even on specific works of the past, this is only one aspect, and in making any single work of art, he, like any great artist, brings together different ideas and different sources. The warrior with shield and this maquette were made shortly after he visited Pompeii, and the photographs on the left of the petrified victims of the volcano at Pompeii he took in 1952. I guess in a strange way they're also part of a classical tradition. So we see Henry Moor, he talked about looking at the great tradition of world sculpture, and we've seen how he looked at what was seen as primitive cultures and also what was seen as the long line of Western civilization from the Greeks and Romans through the Renaissance. The third tradition that he, I think, consciously positioned himself within was the English landscape tradition. And just as a reminder, these are two of the great works of the English landscape tradition by John Constable on the left and by Turner on the right from the early and mid-19th centuries. And I think Moore particularly associated his work with that tradition in two ways. One, in the forms of the sculptures themselves, that for which, particularly in the late 1950s and 1960s, he looked to the landscape, to particular rocks that he knew in Yorkshire, and also that he increasingly imagined his art positioned in the landscape. I mean, my feeling is that in talking about those aspects of Moore which made him popular and successful, and how the same aspects made him unfashionable, certainly amongst artists later on, this association with the landscape is probably the most important. One tends to think of this association with landscape in terms of the tradition of the sublime that is very powerful in English art. This is a painting called Goredale Scar by James Ward. Goredale Scar is a place in Yorkshire where Henry Moore was born. It looks much better here. Goredale Scar is a huge escarpment with a small stream that runs down the middle of it, and because of these huge cliffs, it was a favourite place for artists to represent the terrifying enormity of nature. And I think it's this sort of landscape that Moore seeks to echo in some of his later sculptures. But actually in the 1930s, when he was first thinking about sculpture in the landscape, it was to a different kind of place that he looked. He was one of a number of artists and writers at that time who showed a renewed interest in the prehistoric sites of the English landscape, of Stonehenge and of the stones at Avebury. And Avebury is a place in Wiltshire close to Stonehenge where there are rings of these ancient rocks that have been raised up for reasons unknown, presumably some sort of sacramental purpose, but we don't know. But for Moore and others, the people who made Avebury and Stonehenge were the first British sculptors. And you see Moore in the 1930s now working in the countryside, and I think deliberately making his art look like those sorts of things. So you find him around 1936 placing blocks of stone around the land around his house, and then when he wants to photograph a finished sculpture, he places it on top of one of these stone plinths and photographs it from underneath so that it looks much bigger and much more totemic than perhaps it is. And on the theme of the totem, a totem of course a raising up of images of life and death and birth for religious purposes, let's just momentarily look at this sculpture here. It's a very strange work of art. You remember the sculpture of the baby and the mother's breast. This now is simply the breast. The rounded form is unquestionably the breast. It has a nipple, but then it's caught in this hard-edged, almost mechanical embrace of the stone. So he is, I think, raising up these images of sexuality and of growth and regeneration, of procreation, as if for some primitive ritual. And you see that again in some of these 2- and 3-part sculptures of the 1960s. This is the sculpture at the Lincoln Center in New York, which it's very clearly based on rock formations that Henry Moore had known as a child in Yorkshire in the north of England. But from other angles is very clearly referencing, is both phallic on the one hand and referencing sort of female sexuality on the other. It is a sculpture about phallic penetration. And I think, you know, the heart of Moore's art is this fascination with natural form as a metaphor or as an embodiment of these natural processes, both in nature and in human life. And you see it repeated again and again in different ways. For example, in his fascination with the internal-external form. There are some at the back there, things inside things. Something that is protected and protective. But I'll talk about one example and how that, I think, embodies some of the interesting ambiguities and challenges of Moore's work. I think I talk about this in my essay in the catalogue, so apologies to those who've read it. This is a sculpture called Nuclear Energy that stands at Chicago University in the United States. It was commissioned from Henry Moore in 1963 and it was unveiled in Chicago in 1967. We have to assume the building wasn't pink in 1963. The sculpture was commissioned by the University of Chicago to mark the place where the scientist, the physicist Enrico Fermi achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. Now this event was a key part of the development of the nuclear bomb, and it seems clear that the sculpture Henry Moore made deliberately echoes the shape of the mushroom cloud of a nuclear explosion. Now later in life, in around 1970, Henry Moore posed for this photograph where you can see him apparently working on the maquette for that sculpture. And you can obviously see that next to him is an elephant skull, and Moore explicitly said that the elephant skull was the source for this sculpture. It wasn't. It has been shown that Moore had made the maquette, and he had shown the maquette to the people from Chicago before he had seen the elephant skull. Now, the odd thing about Moore even accepting the commission from Chicago is that he was very publicly a campaigner for nuclear disarmament. He acknowledged, he made it clear that the sculpture that in Chicago was called Nuclear Energy was based on the human skull. And I think it is important that at the same time that he was, just or shortly before he made that sculpture, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, of which he was a founding member, used this image of the human skull and the mushroom cloud fusing together as part of their campaign against the bomb. So it seems that in accepting the commission to mark this place in Chicago, a fundamental site for the development of the bomb, Moore chose to make a sculpture which echoed this representation of the deadliness of that technology. And it's striking that Moore called this sculpture Atom Piece, but the people in Chicago asked that they could call their sculpture Nuclear Energy, which of course is the more peaceful and the more positive outcome of the experiment there. Now, the reason I talk about this is that I think it's important to see that Moore was an artist with radical or ideological intentions, who later in life sought to play down that aspect of his art. And I think one of the weaknesses of this use of a kind of organic metaphor as the fundamental basis for his art, which is also its strength, is that it allows for so many meanings to be read into it. It is precisely that aspect of Moore's art that enabled it to become really the art of the Western metropolitan space in the 1960s and 1970s. This is an aerial view of Philip Nathan Square in Toronto in Canada. The Henry Moore is, I can't move because of my microphone, but it's near that white canopy. I show it because, I mean, in the late 1960s, the mayor of Toronto set out to revive the city and to establish it as an international metropolis. And he said, to do that, he needed a Henry Moore sculpture. And so you see how this Moore's use of natural forms as a kind of metaphor for something human, and the natural harmony, I think, that derives from that, facilitated this position of his as the sculptor of the modern city. You see here at the top left, that is again Toronto. You can see the sculpture doesn't seem so small when you're on the ground. On the right, Paris, the UNESCO HQ. Bottom left, of course, London with the work that you have a small version of here. And then next to that, City Hall in Dallas, Texas. So to conclude, I think in looking at the way Moore drew on different traditions, one might say that his art was an art of synthesis, of reconciliation. It's precisely those qualities that made him so popular, both with a general public and both with Western governments after the Second World War. But of course it is also exactly the same qualities which, when art became more challenging or more ironic and less sincere, made Moore very unfashionable. But for me, when I made a Henry Moore exhibition in London 2 years ago, I found what one needed to do was to recover this lost side of Moore, particularly of the earlier middle periods of his career, in which he was more engaged both with politics and with ideas of human psychology, if you like, of fear, of anxiety, of sexual desire. And the surprising challenge was that to do so, one had not only to overcome Moore's later critics, but also Moore's later self, the way he talked about his own art later in life. Spasiba.